Okay.
There we go.
I will officially start.
Real quick, I forgot to thank the Spanglers, Jen and Rob, for sharing their home and setting up and shoveling and doing all this wonderful stuff. Thank you. Rob and Jana so much. And Madison for managing, and my wife for helping. All that good stuff. Sorry.
So now we're officially.
Now you're.
So, to that question, what are you? There are lots of things. Of course, the term UFO begins to be used by the US military in the late 40s and the early 50s. They start using the term UFO because the popular term, which was all over in the vernacular at this point, was flying saucer. The military did not like the associations that came with the term flying saucer. So they began using UFO, unidentified flying object instead. Now, their initial idea for using this term was, well, what is an unidentified flying object? Maybe it's a bird that you can't recognize. Maybe it's a flash of light. Maybe today it's a drone. Maybe it's a spaceship built on Zeta Reticuli. It could be any of those things, right? The whole point is we just don't know what it is. Now, over the last 50 years, since a UFO has entered the vernacular, UFO means to many people a spaceship from another planet. But it doesn't have to. And that is really what I want to talk about tonight is what is the UFO? What is this weird thing in the sky? This thing we cannot recognize in the sky? What are the various answers that Americans have offered to that question? And what do those different answers tell us? Well, I think they tell us about pretty much everything that's happened in America in the last 80 years. The UFO is a lot. I'm going to give you here, as you see up here on the screen, 3 different narratives for thinking about what the UFO is: the flying saucer, abduction, and contact. These are 3 kind of terms of art in the UFO community, and they point to different ways of conceiving about what these objects are and what they might mean. Now, I of course am talking about this because I come on.
I knew there'd have to be a glitch, right?
So you
All right. I wrote a book about these people, Betty and Barney. And they are the first Americans to claim they were abducted by aliens. So it is from their story that American culture absorbed this idea of missing time. Somebody you don't know where you've been for the last 2 or 3 hours. Hypnotic regression, in which you recover memories of being taken aboard a spacecraft by small, gray, big-eyed aliens. They are the ones who came up with that image of the small, gray, big-eyed alien, which is now ubiquitous. And then remembering all sorts of troubling things like medical experimentation and so on and so forth, right? And being left with kind of a sense of, well, what they describe as trauma. And as we'll talk about, the abduction narrative, which they generate, is really intertwined with the rise of therapy as a mode of talking and thinking about who people are in America in the late 20th century. Therapeutic language has colonized us, right? Everyone speaks in therapy talk now, trauma and recovery and so on and so forth. That's another marker of the UFO. Their experience, though, I think really maps onto these 3 ways of thinking about what UFOs might be. In September 1961, they were driving home from a vacation through central New Hampshire. They lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they saw a strange light in the sky. Now, this was pretty common. It's always been common to see strange lights in the sky. That's a universal human experience. But because they lived when they lived, in the Cold War, in an age in which Americans were really taken by craft in the sky, Sputnik, nuclear weapons, jet planes, this is the age of all of these things. They assumed it was a craft, that is something built, a machine, and they called the federal government to report it because they thought that's what good patriotic citizens would do. Maybe this was a Soviet thing, maybe it was a nuclear weapon, who knows? 3 years later, they undergo hypnosis. And under hypnosis, they recall being taken aboard this craft. be interacting with small gray creatures, talking to them, having uncomfortable medical experiments performed on them. They said we were abducted, and that word and that concept entered American popular culture. They became famous quite quickly. There was a best-selling book written about them. They were all over the media in the mid-1960s. As you see, they're holding a newspaper there. There was a movie made in 1975 starring James Earl Jones as Barney. James Earl Jones actually wanted to make it. He sought out the rights and bought them. And so you have this idea of abduction, right, emerge. And then a few years later, this went in a different direction. It was not simply a scientific problem by the late 1960s, because America was increasingly embracing ways of knowing and understanding the world beyond science. It became, well, to use their vernacular, a spiritual experience for them, something that plugged them in, not simply to another civilization, right, but to the deep patterns and meanings in the universe that might explain their lives in ways far beyond simply being captured by a strange race of species. You see here the gray alien. This was a painting that a friend of Betty and Barney named David Baker did, depicting these creatures that took them. You see here a sketch that Barney drew of the abduction with the craft on the road, their car, and the creatures coming for them. If nothing else, right, it's a kind of terrifying story. So let's then think about these three different ways of thinking about what these UFOs are, and why Betty and Barney responded to them the way they did.
Man, you're gonna talk about the backgrounds of it. They were really
Oh, yeah.
smart, good
Mhm.
people.
Yep, yep,
They're
yep.
not like
We will
they
come
got
back to
whacked
that.
out. Okay.
Yeah, the age of saucers, flying saucers. This is what Betty and Barney thought they saw initially, right? They used the term flying saucer. They used that term because it was all over the media at this point, ever since 1947. In 1947, a man named Kenneth Arnold, who was an amateur pilot, landed his plane near Mount Rainier in Washington and told the ground crew that he had seen a dozen flying objects. He said they were kind of like plates, and they were skipping through the sky, almost like a stone you would throw, and they would skip over the water. When reporters got a hold of this, they were fascinated, and it's actually unclear which reporter did it first, but one reporter called the things flying saucers. And once that identification hit the media, right, they saw these strange things in the sky, they were flying saucers, they were craft. Everyone else who saw strange things in the sky began to assume, what I saw must also be a flying saucer. So this term enters the vernacular, and it becomes incredibly famous in 1952 when there was a whole host of sightings of these things around the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There were a lot of radar hits on the radar. There are pilots who, Navy pilots actually, who fly over the Capitol to see what they can see. Some of them say, I saw strange lights, I don't know what they were. Harry Truman gets very upset. He is the president at this point, and he calls up the Joint Chiefs of Staff and says, figure out what these are. And that leads then to something you've probably heard of, which is Project Blue Book. Who knows about Project Blue Book? Anyone heard of it? You have? Okay. Yeah. This is a 16-year-long official Air Force investigation of these things. Staffed by a number of soldiers who gather up sightings, explore sightings, interview people, travel around the country. There was an FX series called Project Blue Book about 5 years ago about this. It was a kind of fictionalized version of this. And these are the people, some of the people who come to Betty and Barney Hill, who call them up. Now, the hills, when they get home after having seen, and all they saw initially was this strange light in the sky, right? Betty said it looked like a star falling on, and it followed them down the road in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They have a lot of disagreement about whether or not they want to report it. Because they were worried they would look like kooks. That was the word that Barney used. This is troubling to them. Because they are, as Jay said, right, pretty respected members of the Portsmouth community. Betty Hill was a social worker. She had a college degree and she worked for the state social, state social work office helping them children. Barney was a postman. And they were very active in the local NAACP. They were very involved in the civil rights movement. As you noted, they're an interracial couple, which is unusual anywhere in America. There were about 40,000 interracial couples in America in 1960, and they are one of them. Barney is particularly concerned with respectability, which is a term historians often use to describe the lives of Black people in America in the 50s and 60s, right? Martin Luther King was very concerned with this. That's why he wore suits all the time, right? The idea is to say, to prove I'm a respectable person, I command respect. I should be respected. My ideas should be respected. And Barney thought this was very important for his NAACP work. And so he did not want to report this sighting. He was worried about what would come upon them if he did. Betty did want to report it. Betty was interested in flying saucers already. They have a very interesting exchange, which was recalled by the recovered memory. Betty remembers asking her husband as they are driving home after they see this light, "Do you believe in flying saucers now?" And Barney says, "No, that wasn't a flying saucer." Now, why? Why would he say that? He says that because he associates belief in flying saucers with being, as he puts it, kooky. He wants to distance himself from this thing. And in part because of what Project Blue Book does and what the Condon Committee does in 1968. Increasingly, by the mid-1950s, the US government has determined that there's no mechanical threat from these things. Even though about 20% of the cases that Blue Book investigates, they cannot provide an answer for. 80% they say, it was a reflection of light, it was a mistaken bird sighting, something like that, right? But 20% they have no solution for. But they determine there's nothing to this, right? These are not mechanical threat, they're not a security threat. So the government begins a fairly conscious campaign to delegitimate these things. Project Blue Book, and eventually the Condon Committee, which is a government committee chaired by Professor Edward Condon of the University of Colorado, they issue a report in 1968 saying the biggest danger of UFOs is not from the craft themselves, because they're not anything, they're just mistaken identifications. The biggest danger is that American citizens will believe in them. And if American citizens believe in them, that will lead to mass credulity in American society. It will mean we'll be easily taken advantage of by perhaps hostile foreign countries who want to run fear campaigns in our nation. And so we have to discredit these things. And so the military begins telling journalists, only silly people believe in UFOs. They're not respected. They're not respectable. And this is what Betty and Barney run into over and over again. When their story does become public, which it will eventually, they are disbelieved. Many journalists write stories stating their belief that they saw a craft and were abducted by it is the product of the anxiety they feel as an interracial couple in America. Right? That they clearly are under a lot of stress. They clearly are suffering mass anxiety. Even many people who support interracial marriage say this because they say, well, you must be dealing with so many problems, right? And so their sighting and UFOs generally in America become pathologized. That is to say, associated with mental illness, with stress, with a distress condition, not something necessarily to be taken seriously as possible spacecraft from other worlds or whatever else they might be. What's particularly interesting about this is that in 2017, the New York Times revealed that despite the Condon Committee shutting down Project Blue Book and the government stating there's nothing here, move along, It was revealed in 2017 that for almost 2 decades, there actually had been a secret Pentagon program exploring UFOs. Trying to figure out what these things were. This program, you will see it called different things, but the most common name is ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. There had been an office in the Pentagon since 2004. This office collected data on UFO sightings. It gave a lot of money to independent research agencies that were exploring UFOs, and they did come up with stuff. This is the most famous of them. It has been revealed that, well, there's been a number of sightings, and even indeed a number of photographic and video evidence of strange things. The most common is this, well, not this one, this is a different one, but one that people call the Tic Tac. An airline pilot named David Fravor, who was commander of a wing squadron off the USS Roosevelt, an aircraft carrier off of San Diego, reported to his superiors that while on a routine training mission, he and several of his pilots encountered something that looked like a very large Tic Tac moving around the ocean very, very quickly. He said it had no noticeable means of propulsion. It was unclear how it moved, but it would stop, pivot, drive in different directions, up, down. It went into the water and then vanished. And Fravor says, I have no idea what that was. Right? That's one example. There are many, many others, including, as we see, some video. This is called the Go Fast video, this object moving quite quickly. If you watch this video, and it's available on the New York Times website, you will hear pilots saying, what is that thing? How is it moving so quickly? Then in July, this man, David Grush, who resigned from the Pentagon. He was a senior officer in the Pentagon's Office of the Inspector General. He resigned and went to Congress and testified for quite a while in July, saying that and this is always how it is, he said, I have no personal knowledge, but I know people who know things. And he said he had been told by colleagues in the Pentagon that the Pentagon has actually recovered crashed objects. He said that the Pentagon had recovered what he called biological entities, non-human biologics. And he said that the Pentagon believes that these things are the product of what he called NHI. And then a congressman said, what's NHI? And he said, non-human intelligence. So this sense then of UFOs as technology, right, as something built, as craft, something sent here and constructed by other intelligences is still alive. And this is, if you talk to people who are into UFOs, they will say it is quite common for normies, for people who don't know much about this, to assume that these are craft from another world, that they are built on another planet and flown here. That is not what most serious UFO people believe. What they do believe, we will get to momentarily. But first, we need to talk about alien abduction. I have up there 1966. 1966 is the year that Betty and Barney Hill's, a book about them was published. That's called The Interrupted Journey. After several years, after they saw this light in the sky that followed them down the road, right, Betty and Barney were not doing well. Barney Hill was developing ulcers. Betty Hill was having nightmares. Barney Hill eventually goes and sees a therapist. And he's in counseling with this therapist for about 1.5 years before he tells this guy, we saw this weird thing in the sky and it's bothering us and we don't know what it was. Barney's counselor refers them to a man named Benjamin Simon. Benjamin Simon was a psychiatrist. He was in his early 60s. He had served in the US military for more than 20 years. He was one of the leading, one of the kind of founding doctors who treated post-traumatic stress disorder. in the US military, although they did not call it PTSD at that point, right? But he was one who identified this as a disorder, and he used hypnosis to treat it. Betty and Barney Hill made an appointment to go see him, and they wanted to be hypnotized because they wanted to remember everything they could about this. Now, this is fairly key. What Benjamin Simon told them was this. He said, human memory is not like a series of shelves or a library in your brain. When you remember something, it's not as though you go to the right shelf, pull the book off the ledge, and open it, and there's the memory. Memory is something constantly created. Whenever you remember something, you are remembering it in the context of now. You're thinking about different things. You're approaching the memory differently. And so that memory is reconstructed. So Simon said, hypnosis is not going to recover your memories because your memories aren't there to be recovered. They're not sitting on a shelf in your brain somewhere. What he did say is hypnosis can help you with what he called emotional memory. He said we can access your feelings about this event. We can explore the feelings that have been persisting since this event, but we're not going to be able to get that memory back. Now, this has proved a point of real contention among UFO people. We'll get to more of that momentarily. But Simon hypnotized them. And under hypnosis, over the course of about 3 months, he separates them, and that's key. They're hypnotized separately. One of them waits in his waiting room, the other one is taken to his office. They both tell this story. The craft, as you saw in that drawing, landing on the road in front of them. Small creatures coming out of the craft, taking them aboard, subjecting them to medical experimentation. Betty Hill recalled a needle being inserted into her navel. And she screamed and she asked them, the aliens, what is this? And one of them, who she said could speak with her, who spoke English, told her it was a pregnancy test. Now, this was before immunocytosis was a thing. Who knows what that is all about, right? Barney Hill recalled similar kind of things, and then they're taken back to their car and told they won't remember this. Now, after this 3 months of them recovering these memories and telling Simon all about this, the Hills vividly recall this, even out of hypnosis. The memories are there for them. Benjamin Simon tells them, remember what I told you. Simon believes that what they had done was what he called a confabulation. That is the generation of false memories, which is quite possible with hypnosis. You can implant false memories if you know how to do it in people. He tells them that he believes these memories were generated from Betty's nightmares. Remember I said she had nightmares? She had nightmares for about a month after this sighting. She told her husband, well, she told a friend about the nightmares in her husband's presence. And Barney says, I believe what happened is you both took these nightmares and have recast them as your own memories. What then are they actually worried about? What is the problem here? What is this terrible thing that they're recovering? Simon believes it has to do with Barney's racial anxieties. He finds that Barney is frequently, in his recalled memory of this whole vacation they took to Canada, Barney is always telling Simon, we went to a hotel. I was worried they wouldn't give us a room because I'm black. We went to a restaurant. The waitress was staring at me. I'm worried that she's staring at me because I'm black. He believes that they were on edge the whole trip, and that Barney particularly was on edge. And he points to some facts that Barney recalls while under hypnosis. Now, neither of them, even under hypnosis, really give a clear description of what these aliens look like, but Barney describes them by analogy. He says they remind him of Nazis. Now, he's a World War II veteran. He fought in the war during World War II. He says at one point, they remind me of Irish people. And Simon says, why? And he says, because Irish people are often hostile to Negroes. So Barney is associating this experience with race. Betty is not, which is, I think, in and of itself interesting. They actually end up in a little bit of a tiff with Simon about whether or not this really happened. He tries to convince them that it didn't over and over and over again. They're not having it. And they actually say that Simon is clearly influenced by, he's afraid that he will look foolish if he endorses it. That's why he's not endorsing this. But they eventually go public. They meet a journalist named John Fuller. John Fuller writes a book based almost entirely on the hypnosis transcripts, which do exist. You can read the hypnosis transcripts, they're quite fascinating. He writes a book called The Interrupted Journey, and it becomes massive. It sells 350,000 copies in a year. They're on all sorts of TV, all over the news. And this idea then of abduction, that this is a thing the aliens do, becomes increasingly prevalent. As does something that Betty and Barney come to believe by the late 1960s, which is this. Why would the Air Force just dismiss their story out of hand? What's going on there? They called the Air Force eventually. They reported this and nothing happened. They grow frustrated because of that. They come to believe something that's increasingly easy to believe by the early 1970s, which is that the state knows more than it's telling us. Now remember, this is the era first of Vietnam, when it becomes quite evident by the late 60s that the US government is providing the citizenry with misleading data about how the war in Vietnam was going. It is, by 1974, the age of Watergate and Richard Nixon. Increasingly, then, the Hills become persuaded that there's something going on here that they don't quite understand. And this then metastasizes in the 1970s. And over the course of the 1970s and 1980s, these two narratives of abduction as something that is happening to people, and the sense that the state is hiding things, concealing things, covering things up, they become intertwined. I want to tell you a couple of stories that indicate that. The first is about Dulce Base and a poor, sad man named Paul Benowitz. Anyone ever hear of Dulce Base? All right, we're pretty deep in the UFO weeds with Dulce Base, so I'm not
I was gonna ask,
yeah, please.
just so we can be thoughtful about each other, and if anybody, you don't have to raise your hand, but if anybody's felt like they've seen a UFO or had an abduction. The abduction is probably pretty low on the list, but maybe seen a UFO.
Yeah. Given the number of people in this room and the statistics that we have, I'd be surprised if there weren't any.
Okay, that's good to know.
I just asked a quick.
Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. when you start making fun of people.
I don't know what the timing is, of course, but in the post-war period, there's also a lot of government cover-up about the effects of radioactive radiation.
Yeah, nuclear experimentation.
And the government downplayed the
Yes.
danger to the public.
Yeah,
And even suppressed information about Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
yeah.
So I wonder how much that.
That
also
becomes
goes into
public in the
this.
1980s.
Yeah,
So by the time that's public, it certainly is playing into this.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And in fact, that is something that Benny and Barney are worried about. They talk about radiation initially after their sighting. And Benny says that we called the government after they just saw the light in the sky because they didn't know if it might be radioactive or not. So it's clearly on their minds. Okay, let's talk about Paul Benowitz. Dulce, New Mexico. We're talking very, very northern New Mexico here, up near the Colorado border. There is a US military base up there. It's actually not called Dulce Base. It doesn't have a name, but Dulce is the kind of closest town to it. Benowitz is a businessman in this small town of Dulce. And now this is the late 70s and early 80s. He sees periodically strange lights coming off this military base and buzzing around in the sky. And he starts filming them and taking photographs. And he begins going to various UFO organizations saying, look what I see. And they're over this military base. What is this all about? And eventually he meets a guy named Richard Doty. Richard Doty tells Benowitz that he is employed by US military intelligence. And he tells Benowitz, those are UFOs. He tells Benowitz, and this is something you may have heard because it has gotten into the public culture a lot more. He tells Benowitz that in 1955, Dwight Eisenhower signed a treaty with aliens. And this treaty meant that the US government would receive technology from this alien species, And that in exchange, Eisenhower authorized the aliens to abduct American citizens and perform experiments on them. And he tells Benowitz that underneath Vilcabas, going 12 floors down, there is a massive military installation in which American military people are working on alien spacecraft, where aliens will come periodically to interact with American military representatives. And Benowitz's mind is blown because Doty provides him with a lot of evidence that Doty is actually an employee of American military intelligence. So Benowitz begins telling everybody he knows of this because he thinks this is, massive national security issues and so on and so forth. And Benowitz becomes simultaneously more and more famous, but also to many people, and even many UFO people, less and less and less credible. In 1989, Richard Doty meets with another guy, a man named William Moore, who we'll say a bit more about in a moment. William Moore tells, Richard Doty tells William Moore that he is in fact military intelligence, but that everything he's told Benowitz is a lie. That he is giving Benowitz misinformation in order to make it so that no one would take Benowitz's photos of strange lights and crafts above this military base seriously. This, as you might imagine, this revelation, which William Moore shares with the world in a speech at the national meeting of the Mutual UFO Network, which is the largest UFO organization in America, it just burns down the house. And even today in the UFO community, there's a really, really deep divide as to if you believe in the first thing Doty said, which was about the Eisenhower Treaty and all of that, or the second thing that Richard Doty said, which was he made all of that up as a disinformation campaign to discredit Paul Benowitz. It may have accomplished, if the latter, it may have accomplished what Doty wanted, which is to say, dirtying the waters, confusing everybody. People who believe that are likely to believe then in many other conspiracies, which leads us to Roswell. You've all heard about Roswell, I hope. What is interesting about Roswell is that it wasn't discussed at all among American UFO investigators until the 1980s. When the same guy, William Moore, went to Roswell, New Mexico, interviewed a bunch of people, found this photograph. This is Major Jesse Marcel, who is an officer at the Roswell Air Force Base, holding the material that they found in the field north of the city of Roswell on July the 6th, 1947. Something did crash there. Absolutely, something crashed there. Initially, the Roswell newspaper put out a headline, and this is the local little dinky Roswell, New Mexico newspaper. The headline the day after the crash was, "Flying saucer crashes near Roswell." The next day, the headline was, "U.S. Air Force announces it was a weather balloon."
It was like,
A weather balloon. And that's where most people left it. William Moore, though, discovered that original headline in the late 70s, and he went to Roswell, and he began talking to people. He found this guy, Jesse Marcel, who held this stuff, and Jesse Marcel, who was by then in his 90s, told William Moore that whatever it was that he's holding in that picture, he said it was a metal, but it was like no metal I've ever seen on Earth. And so Moore begins digging and digging and digging even more. And he finds all these secondhand stories in which people will tell him something that their dad said he saw back in 1947 and so on and so forth. And eventually Moore writes a book saying essentially that the crash at Roswell was a UFO, the government has it. And we don't know what they're doing with it or where they have it. Now by the 1980s, right, by the mid 80s, after Paul Benowitz, after all of these national security scandals, people are really ready to believe that. And then a couple of other guys enter the scene, Bud Hopkins and Whitley Strieber. Bud Hopkins is an artist who lives in New York. He reads John Fuller's book about Betty and Barney Hill, and he decides to try his hand at it. So he teaches himself hypnosis, and he begins hypnotizing people. And he starts to discover over and over and over again. People are telling him these small gray creatures came in my room late at night and they took me into their craft. And they did medical experiments on me and they put me back. Hopkins is a pretty controversial figure. There are many people who say he's hypnotizing these people and then he's asking them, were you abducted by aliens? And they're saying yes, because they're hypnotized. And hypnosis is a state of really enhanced cooperation. There are other people who believe absolutely and are struck by how similar all of the stories he uncovers are. He writes a book called Missing Time, in which he states that, building on Paul Benowitz, that the alien species, these little gray creatures, are trying to create a human-alien hybrid race that will eventually colonize this earth because their home world is dying. It's an environmental message. They have destroyed their home world and they want to come here and live.
Filter earth.
Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber is a novelist, and he wrote a book in 1990 called Communion. It was made into a movie with Christopher Walken. And Strieber's book is probably the most effective book at gaining converts to believe in UFOs, because it is terrifying. It is extraordinarily well written. It's called Communion. And he describes in this book his own abduction, the hypnosis that he undergoes, and all these bizarre things that happen to him. And he ends this book with the sense, right, that there is some deep plan here. The aliens are not just here having fun, right? They're trying to do something with us. And it's terrifying, whatever it is. So these various cultural channels, right, that are emerging out of the Hill case, metastasize, grow, expand, create this really powerful subculture of UFO belief that occasionally pops up into the surface in things like the X-Files and movies, right, about UFOs. A lot of these images or ideas, right, you may have heard in popular media, but there is a really well-developed narrative about what is happening with abduction, what is happening with aliens, what is happening with the UFO government, that a fairly large proportion of American citizens believe, that is cobbled together from all of these different stories.
What's the percentage?
It depends on how you break that down, right? But somewhere around 20 to 25% of Americans believe that human beings have made contact with aliens, that aliens are here. Now, what's really going on here? Let's talk about New Age movement. Remember I said a little bit ago that the most common belief, right, is that these people built spaceships on another planet and flew here. That's what Betty and Barney Hill believed. They eventually came to believe that they came here from the star system Zeta Reticuli, which Betty identified on a map in the craft. Increasingly, though, more and more and more UFO believers, especially people like Whitley Strieber, have come to believe that's not actually what's going on at all. That it's something very different and weirder than that. And we have to go back all the way to Theosophy for this. Theosophy is a kind of quasi-religious spiritual cultural movement that emerges in the United States after the Civil War in the last half of the 19th century. It is largely the product of a woman named Helena Blavatsky, who said that she had traveled to Nepal and had studied with Hindu and Buddhist masters and was bringing their ancient wisdom to the United States. Now, like many people in the United States, what she produces is kind of doesn't quite resemble what's actually going on in the Indian subcontinent or in Nepal. But Blavatsky argues that that all of human intelligence exists on a scale, and that we're pretty low on the scale. But as people grow more and more spiritual, and even after death, intelligences rise on this scale. And she's drawing here from Hinduism and Buddhism and notions of reincarnation and the wheel of samsara and so on and so forth, right? And she argues that there are spiritual beings far in advance of us, whom her followers call the ascended masters. And these are beings that have attained enlightenment. And they're out there in the universe and they want to help us.
This is after Joseph Smith.
Yes, yeah, this is late 19th century, yeah.
Sounding very familiar.
Yeah, although for her, she would argue many of them are not, they don't have bodies, right? That they have transcended the material world.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
And so on and so forth, right? So she says that, right? And this becomes a fairly popular movement, theosophy, in the late 19th century. And there's a lot of even the word New Age comes from theosophy, and they embrace a lot of stuff, like kind of a bricolage, which is kind of combining things from many different cultures, from Egypt, from Hinduism, from Buddhism, and develop this kind of really powerful cultural synthesis. Then, about 40 years after that, in the 1950s, a guy named George Adamski comes along. George Adamski lives in Southern California. He is interested in theosophy. He reads a lot of theosophical stuff. And then he starts seeing UFOs. And at one point, he's out in the high desert over the San Gabriel Mountains from Los Angeles, and a UFO lands near him. And this guy comes out of it. A tall, blonde man named Orthon from Venus. And Orthon tells George Adamski, humanity is in a spiritual crisis. Humanity needs to develop harmony with the universe and ascend to its next level of existence. Orthon sounds a lot like a theosophist, except he's not a mystical spiritual being, right? He's not a Bhagavatsya, right? He's not a kind of transcendent Hindu guru. He's an alien. And Adamski then inaugurates this whole movement of people, many of them influenced by theosophical ideas, right, about spiritual growth and progress and meditation and mystical rites and things like that, that were associated in the 19th century with this kind of ripped off Hinduism and Buddhism that theosophy had produced. They're now associating them with UFOs. And it is in some ways a kind of technologicalization of theosophy, a translation of theosophy into this language of science. And this idea, right, that these spiritual beings are from other planets, not from another dimension or anything like that. That becomes quite popular in the 50s and 60s, and you see the emergence of many UFO religions in the 60s based around this kind of belief. Heaven's Gate is the most famous of them, right? You may all remember back in the mid-90s, many of them believers in Heaven's Gate died by mass suicide because they believed that their souls would be captured by a UFO and taken to another planet to live. But the Raelians are still around. And there's a good number of these groups. For them, then, UFOs mean something quite different than what they mean to someone like Whitley Strieber or Bud Hopkins, who are like, for them, UFO people are coming here to colonize our planet and eliminate human life. For people like Adamski, they're here to help us attain a higher spiritual sense of being. We'll talk about two more people, then we'll wrap up. Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée is a French computer scientist, has a PhD in computer science, and works primarily as a computer scientist. In 1969, he wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, which has proved incredibly influential. And if you're a real UFO head, you know Passport to Magonia. Vallée argues in this book that whatever these strange things are, they're not spaceships from other planets. The technology doesn't make sense. Zeta Reticuli is 6.2 light years away. They're not going to fly here. Vallée says, what's very interesting, though, is that story of being captured by small beings, taken to a dark and unfamiliar place, and then released. That's a really common fairy tale. These stories of lights flying through the sky, moving far quicker than any human craft could. 1,000 years ago, people called those angels or demons. He argues that whatever this thing is, and the term he uses, which is now a very common term in the UFO community, the phenomenon. Whatever it is, Villay says, it's been happening as long as humanity has been around. And perhaps the only reason we are talking about it as though it's the product of other civilizations' technology is because we, at this point in our lives as a species, are obsessed with technology. We want to build spaceships and fly them around. So we just assume that whatever these things are spaceships. Villay proposes what has come to be called, as opposed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, right, which is the idea that these things come from another planet, the interdimensional hypothesis, which is to say these things, whatever they are, they exist maybe on a different realm than we do, a different phase of existence.
So that's more of a spiritual.
Yeah,
What we would.
in some, yeah, I mean,
It's-
loose interpretation of the word spiritual, right?
H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah. Well, you might imagine it like this, right? Say that we all are living in an aquarium. We're fish in an aquarium, right? And one day, the guy who owns the aquarium comes and sticks his finger in the water. And we all go, whoa, what is that? Right? Maybe these things are in a fifth, sixth dimension. And they pop into our dimension sometimes and then back out, and we don't know what to make of it or what to do about it.
Many people think we're just living in a simulation.
Yeah.
It's a whole other one, but this is more like angels. But you're
Yeah.
popping in.
Mhm. This is what Villay argues and Villay proposes. And it comes to be in some ways where the hills end up going. By the late 1960s, the hills are contacted by a guy named Robert Bowman. And Robert Bowman tells them, you had this bizarre experience, right? But I think there's much more to it than just an abduction and a sighting of a craft. I think humanity is moving towards spiritual transcendence, that we're entering a new age of spiritual being, and you people are a sign. These higher beings have given your experience to us to help us all kind of imagine what that thing might mean. And so for several nights in June 1967, the Hills and several of their friends camp in a field in remote New Hampshire while Betty Hill meditates and tries to summon a UFO with her mind. Was she successful? Some of them thought so. They didn't see one that night, but UFO sightings did start happening in other places. By the 1970s, a tragedy happens and Barney Hill dies at age 46 in 1969, quite suddenly. And Betty, after that, begins more and more and more looking to people like George Adamski and saying, like, is he still alive somewhere? She meets a number of people, some people who channel, who tell her that they can contact him. And that there are spirits out there who want to communicate with Barney. And the aliens who abducted them were aware of these spirits and were aware somehow of Barney's own death. She starts to see more and more lights in the sky, lights that kind of communicated meaning to her. And she becomes convinced, ultimately, that Robert Bowman was right, that these craft are not just messing with her and her husband, but are rather signaling the need for human spiritual awakening in ways that she was not aware of before. And that'll lead me to my final guy, John Mack. John Mack was a professor of psychology at Harvard who grew interested in UFOs in the 1980s. And he began hypnotizing people too, just like many of these other people did. But he becomes convinced that these abductions are not frightening, that rather there is a kind of coming awakening conscience in humanity, and that these experiences are happening to people to prod us as a collective towards higher levels of spiritual awareness. He wrote a famous book about this called Abduction in 1993. It almost lost him tenure at Harvard. Before his case was fully worked through at Harvard, he was killed in a car accident. But his book has remained very popular and a kind of counterpoint to the story of UFOs as something terrifying and frightening, rather as something that are kind of pushing us to grapple with what it means to be human in ways that we might not be able to do otherwise. So then to wrap up, right, what are UFOs? There are a lot of things. And that's, I think, why they are so interesting and so useful to me as a scholar, right? Studying what people understand strange lights in the sky, strange sounds, visits from strange creatures to be, really exposes a lot about what we as humans are worried about, what we grapple with, what frightens us, what inspires us. We project all of that onto these unidentified flying objects. Carl Jung wrote a book, the famous psychologist wrote a book about UFOs in the 1950s. It's called A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. And Jung says in that book, it doesn't matter if the thing in the sky is simply a bird or an airplane, right? What matters is the meanings that we project onto it.
Carl Sagan was less kind.
Carl Sagan was. I write at the end of my book about Betty and Barney that I think they saw something. I don't know what it was they saw, but they saw something that unnerved them. They saw something that really threw them into a crisis of some kind. I don't think they were abducted. I'm with Benjamin Simon on that. I trust him maybe more than I do them on what hypnosis can do. But I do think they saw something weird. And leaving that kind of door open a crack, I think has been good for me as a human, I hope. Okay, there we are.
So, in your book, you talk about them being pretty deep in the universalist faith.
Yes, they're
Which-
Unitarians.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Unitarians, and that's interesting because they had kind of had that blend, kind of like, seemed like Joseph Smith a bit of a scientific materialism, but spirituality. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why they reject Benjamin Simon saying that their hypnosis was a confabulation was because they were Unitarian, right? Unitarians in the 1950s and 60s were very suspicious of Sigmund Freud and the notion of the unconscious, because they really held tightly to the notion of human rationality, human autonomy, the idea that we make our own decisions, that reason can understand the universe. And there's a lot of really wonderful Unitarian quotations from the 50s, more or less calling Freud a dark mystic. Yeah, so when they have this hypnosis, right, they're like, well, I remember this. I'm a rational human being. I trust my memory. And Simon is telling them, no. Human beings we're less in control of ourselves than we like to think. And that's one major rift between the two of them. But they stay Unitarians until they die.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah.
The other thing is I just keep finding parallels,
Mhm.
not to turn this into a religious discussion, but with kind of the beginnings of our LDS faith, which you are an active member of. And what things have arose in your mind with that whole thinking about some of those parallels and interesting things?
Yeah, and in fact, so I wrote that column, right, for the Tribune about Mormonism and UFOs, and I'm turning that into a book right now about the history of Mormon interaction with UFOs. What really, so there's kind of two ways to think about it. One is, I think, it goes back into the 19th century, right? And of course, it's kind of widely known among thinky Mormon people, right, that there are all these stories and people recalling Joseph Smith telling them there were people on the moon and stuff like that. That's actually a really, really common 19th century belief. There's a lot of people who thought there were people living on the moon and on other planets. And I think because what you see, even in that early period, is this real sense, right, that religion and science are not separate things, that they're both ways of learning about the universe, right? And if God made this massive, gigantic, huge cosmos, it just stands to reason there are people elsewhere on it, right? And that kind of optimism about what human beings can know about the universe, what we can discover, what science can illustrate, that's deep in the bones of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all of these kind of, this sort of materialist way of thinking about religion, right? Then nothing is really a mystery. And that's very, very true, I think, about UFO enthusiasm as well. Right, the sense that and what you will find, even in people like Adamski, right, this notion that human beings are kind of poised on the brink of revelation, right? And these people are here to tell us how the universe works, and then we'll become kind of galactic partners with them, and so on and so forth, right? There's a very kind of, in one of these UFO religions, there's a very almost Star Trek-ish utopianism, right? In the sense that science can solve all of our problems. And we can become kind of rational and enlightened human beings. Now, the hypnosis people are on a kind of different planet from that, right?
Right.
The Whitley Strieber kind of group. Right, there's a real kind of horror, which I do think though kind of mirrors a lot of the anxieties of the late 20th century, right? In the sense that science is not something that's going to fix our world. Science is something that we really don't have control of anymore. It's gotten out of control and it's going to destroy us, which is kind of climate anxiety, right? In many ways, or nuclear holocaust and that sort of thing. You see that expressed with them, but there's less of that in Mormonism, right? Mormonism is more on this kind of like utopian rationalist bent.
Well, then you got Mormon transhumanism, which takes that.
Yeah,
other
absolutely.
step, right, with the
Right.
technology. Yeah.
There-
Fascinating.
There's a lot of,
Super interesting.
let's say there's a lot of, well, a couple things I was thinking of is one, that there's the whole fascination starting in the 70s with Eric von Daniken's ideas of
Yeah, ancient aliens. This is the ancient
it's
aliens.
really like the aliens have fully replaced angels by that
Yeah.
point, and they're coming down here to help us. One movie I remember from early 50s that kind of reflected, I think what you're talking about, the Adamski and all that was The Day the Earth Stood Still. That was kind of an outlier because it imagined aliens being benevolent rather than coming to attack us, but nevertheless having powers that would neutralize whatever we had.
They could save us from ourselves, right? Which is the message of so many of these people, right? Is like, you guys have made nuclear bombs, but we're here to stop you from blowing yourselves up. That kind of thing.
I read one of those things recently and it quoted Bill Gates as saying he thought it was far more likely that this is our future selves coming back than some other race
So there are
coming here.
There are four prominent UFO hypotheses.
Okay.
The extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is they're coming from the planets, the interdimensional hypothesis, which is they're coming from other levels of reality, the us from the future hypothesis, which is they are us from the future, or the least believed, but I think in some ways most fun, which is to say the terrestrial hypothesis, which is they are actually a civilization that already exists on Earth and we just don't know that they're here. That will lead you down a rabbit hole that is popular among some Mormons, which is the hollow Earth theory.
My dad had that one. Yeah, that illustration.
Is that where the lost tribes are?
Yeah, that's where they.
And there's a division in Mormonism on that. There are some people like John Heinerman who believe that the lost tribes are in the Palladian star system.
Okay.
And the Palladians, if any of you are into kind of like New Age stuff, the Palladians are the good guys. The Palladian aliens are the good guys, as opposed to the Zeta Reticulans, which are hostile, and the Reptilians, which are hostile as well. So if you buy John Heinerman and some other Mormon writers, that's where the lost 10 tribes are, and they're going to come back and save us at some point when the Antichrist attacks Zion. But there's another faction of Mormons who believe in the hollow Earth theory, which is to say that they went into the north and down into a cave.
This sounds like Visions of Glory.
Yeah, exactly. Visions of Glory is.
Oh, that's a whole other conversation.
But I did read it.
Visions of Glory is all it's I can draw direct lines from George Adamski.
Can you really? That's
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Julie Rowe as well. Julie Rowe and many of these, there's this kind of new wave of Mormon UFO believers who are not extraterrestrial people, but who are interdimensional people. And Julie,
zombie people.
the Daybells are among them. Julie Rowe is among them, right? And Julie Rowe talks about UFOs. And she argues, right, that they are evil spirits from other dimensions that have been sent to assault us, and then that will fade into kind of the light worker people, right? And then this whole kind of new age way of thinking about these things.
So do
Interesting.
other countries have similar
Yes,
folklore,
they do.
similar timelines?
Yes. There is so Britain has a major one. There's something called the Rendlesham Forest incident, which is often called Britain's Roswell. Which is a major UFO sighting that many military people had about 45 years ago. So there's a lot of, and actually crop circles, which you all might be familiar with, actually emerge in Britain. The British were the first to have those, and those are fascinating because, of course, in the 19th century they would have been fairy circles, right? But when they happened in the 20th century, it's technology, must be technology, right? Yeah, so I whenever I talk about Betty and Barney, I say they're the first American abduction because there is an abduction case before then, and that happened in Brazil, in 1957 to a farmer named Antonio Dias, who said he was taken aboard the ship and experimented on and all of that. And I've done digging, and a lot of people have, but it seems almost no way that Betty and Barney could have heard of him, because his case was not really written about in English until the late 60s. But yeah, UFO folklore is pretty international.
Universal.
Yeah,
Interesting.
both of you. So I don't know, you guys want to
Yeah, let's,
like paper, rock, scissors, but
I'm struck by, I mean, I think he says, Carl Jung, he said, it doesn't really matter, what matters is the meaning you project onto it.
Mhm.
And so I'm just wondering if, because that resonates with me, because I just see humans doing this all the time, whether it's UFOs or religion or. So I'm wondering if this has affected you, as you studied this, does this affect the way that you assign meaning to events that occur in your life,
Yeah.
to religious stories? Has this changed the way you think about that when you're assigning your own meaning to things?
yeah. You know what? I think when it's really so I'll get a little like abstract here, but we often we all have, right, our assumptions about what our baseline of normal, right? What is normal? And we assume that normal is kind of a chronologically and geographically universal.
Yeah.
That what we believe as normal, our baseline of normal, is what everyone else shares. And I think with this topic more than anything else, kind of it shaken that up a little bit for me to say, like, what is possible? What's not possible? What do I assume is normal or is not normal? Right. And seeing this, you know, one thing I say in the book is this: Betty and Barney don't have that light in the sky. What was it? Maybe it was a spaceship. Maybe it was an angel, right? Maybe it was a kind of psychic projection, like somebody else thought it was. I just don't know. I will never know what that light in the sky that they saw was. Now I can assign kind of maybe probabilities to that, but at some level I have to be kind of okay with my idea of like what is possible or not possible being a little bit tentative and having that door cracked just a little bit. And it might be something that that I cannot imagine. Or maybe it is like, maybe it was me from the future. I don't know. Flying back to say hello. Yeah. So I think I kind of a tentativeness and a humility before being certain about meanings, I think is what's been most useful for me here. So yeah.
Well, I was gonna mention, Rick Strassman and others have done experiments with DMT, with giving that to people and having them talk about their experiences. And one interesting thing he found in many of the people was that they, not all, but some described interacting with little men, what seemed little beings or whatever. And some did describe things that were reminiscent of being abducted by aliens and being probed.
Yeah. There are investigators who would kind of riff off of Jung and say, well, like maybe little strange guys are kind of a universal human archetype. Maybe that's something behind all of us. And it's a structural anxiety that the entire human species has.
Like we all see elves.
Yeah, maybe we call them elves or trolls or gnomes or whatever, right? Or aliens or greys, but this kind of archetype of the universal little guy is there. Now, I don't know about that, right? Because I think I guess like I said, then there's some of this tentativeness I have before saying like, this is the answer. This will explain this. But yeah, the same thing might be said, right, for near-death experiences and how similar, there have been people who argue that near-death experiences are very similar to the birth experience, right? You're traveling down a tunnel towards a light, and so on, right? Which would be a kind of psychological explanation for that, which maybe, but I don't want to be certain about it.
Other questions?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, my questions are gonna be so much more basic.
Sure.
Number one, do we know Doty? Was he actually,
He's still alive. He gives interviews.
was he actually military
Yeah,
intelligence?
he was. He's retired now, but he absolutely was military intelligence. He will say, now I have heard him interviewed, and actually I've seen him once. He will say, that universally what he told Benowitz. He said, yeah, I was given a file and I was sent to Benowitz to tell him this. He will not say if he believes what was in that file. He will not say if he believes it's true or not, but he will say, yeah, I did talk to Paul.
Okay, so a couple other quick
Yeah,
questions.
please.
The timeline on the hills.
Mhm.
64 is when they saw the light.
61.
64.
64 is hypnosis sessions.
Okay, sorry, are there distinctions then between when they see the light and when the abduction actually happens, or is that all one event?
So they see the light, they get home. Over the next month, Benny begins having nightmares. Barney develops an ulcer. They both develop anxiety. He seeks out a therapist in 1963. They go under hypnosis in 1964, and then they say, this is what happened to us, but we didn't remember it. The memory was blocked out initially.
And is that a common feature of the idea that the memory will be blocked out? I mean, the aliens told them that they would.
And that has become really standard in most abduction narratives now. Is that people will be hypnotized and say, yes, the aliens came and got me. They told me I wouldn't remember, but under hypnosis, I can recover these memories. So the hypnosis kind of narrative, as it has developed in American culture since, has hypnosis and recovered memory as an integral part of it. It's also very interesting, I think, that this became very, very popular in the United States at about the same time as the Satanic Panic, which was also using recovered memories. Right, and this is when many children around the country begin under hypnosis reporting that people they knew, their daycare, down in Lehigh, a bishop's family would take these children, put on black robes and hold satanic rituals and abuse them.
And fly through the air and
Yeah, all sorts of things.
bury people that
And-
were never, they dug where the kids said they were buried, never found anything.
Yeah. This was kind of a nationwide cultural panic. There were cases in Utah and California, New Jersey, and New York. It was all over the news for a few years, and then it began to die down, and people began to think, oh, well, maybe recovered memory is not terribly reliable. But it's fascinating that the emergence of the abduction narrative happens at about the same time as that. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, one last.
Yes,
one.
please.
Last year I read between Pulpit and Pew.
Oh, yeah,
You were not the one who wrote about UFOs.
I was not. I wrote about Bigfoot in that book.
Yes. There's a couple essays in there too.
Yeah, Raising the Dead is the other one.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah.
I don't remember who, Van Wagner or somebody who wrote that.
Yeah, it was Michael Van Wagner who wrote the UFO.
Okay.
That's what there. Yeah.
How did you get from that to publishing this book this last year?
Oh yeah, you guys came in a bit late. I began working on UFOs because I was really interested in how American religion transformed in the late 20th century. And how older models of kind of religion as an institution that people join has become increasingly displaced by kind of cultural mixing and the rise of these kind of pseudoscientific narratives and stuff like that. And that led me, well, initially I was going to write a book about Scientology, but I was afraid of getting sued. And there have been 2 really good books in Scientology published in the last 10 years, which I would recommend. One is by Hugh Urban, it's called The Church of Scientology, and it's really excellent. But then I was kind of kicking around, I want to do something with UFOs because I think UFOs and religion kind of blend science and religion. They cross boundaries in interesting ways. So I was just looking around and I found that Betty and Barney Hill's niece had donated to the University of New Hampshire about 10 years ago all of their letters. And I thought, wow, that's an incredible source. Because this is a famous case, right? UFO people will say, this is the case that brought abduction to our notions, right? There have been movies made about it. But those letters, no one else has looked at them. So I thought, that's it. I'm gonna go. And I went up to New Hampshire and I spent a couple weeks up there reading all their letters and wrote the book. Yeah.
Now, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned a statistic, which might be hard to measure, about what percentage of people who say they have witnessed something?
Yes, that varies a lot by what survey you have, but there are some surveys that will show around 40% of Americans say they have seen a UFO.
Wow.
Now, what's a UFO, right? As we've seen, but like something strange in the sky that cannot have been
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And about half of that will say they believe that there are aliens visiting our planet. And about half of that will say, what you said, the notion that human civilization was actually put here by aliens.
Mm,
And we are cattle. And they sent us down here, they helped us build the pyramids, and they're just watching us.
Oh, there's an alien.
Yeah. That is, the History Channel will show you a lot of TV shows about that, if you are interested. So,
I'm sure.
aliens.
Other questions?
Couple online.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Thank you.
A fun one. Given the time frame, who's the original Barney and Betty? The Hills or the Flintstones or the Rubble?
You know what? Doug Fabrizio asked me that on.
That's
Oh,
And then you cut it out. Because I don't know. Now, the Flintstones TV show did not begin until after these people were known in the media.
Interesting.
So it's a weird coincidence, and it might not be a coincidence, but I don't have to. So-
A second question from Dan Eastman. He says in the 1980s, when he was at USU, he got taken on a small group to go walk through the foothills of Smithfield, Utah to see the site of a supposed flying saucer landing site. Does anyone know about that?
Oh, I don't.
No.
No.
I heard, I remember reading something, I believe this happened around the time of World War I before the US got in there, but I remember there was a guy who claimed to have had access to advanced technology or whatever.
In Smithfield?
It might have been in Smithfield, but it was in Utah during about the time of World War I.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I'm not familiar with that, unfortunately.
So what's the consensus about the dude who just,
Grush.
is that the guy who?
David Rush.
Yeah, who just testified for it,
Right.
So, yeah.
and the non-human
Yeah, good
biologics.
Yeah. So there is actually something in Congress now called the UAP caucus.
Uh-huh.
Now, UAP is now the term that the government
Yes.
uses because UFO has been taken over by the
Finished
X-Files.
baggage.
Yes.
So they say unidentified anomalous phenomena. And it used to be, it was originally unidentified aerial
Aerial,
phenomena,
yeah.
but it has been changed to anomalous
Okay.
because you remember the Tic Tac
Uh-huh.
went underwater
Okay.
and started moving right underwater.
Okay.
So, and there have been reports of strange things underwater too.
Yeah.
There is a group of members of Congress, a kind of weird coalition of some like Tea Party Republican types and some Democrats who have all kind of come together and said we need to get to the bottom of this. In the Senate, the two most vociferous are Kirsten Gillibrand and Marco Rubio.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is a weird coalition.
Yeah.
But it's just nice to see a coalition. Maybe that's their strategy.
There was a proposed amendment that Chuck Schumer offered to the annual Military Defense Authorization Act that would have required the Pentagon to turn over all of its data on these things to Congress, and it was voted down. There is, though, a new office in the Pentagon that is supposed to be reporting all of this stuff to Congress. UFO people don't think the office is doing anything. They think it's just another cover up, right? But there are questions, and David Grush testified before a closed session. Now, in the public session, which was on C-SPAN and everything, he didn't say anything that wasn't in the statement he already gave. But he said a lot of what I could tell you is you need clearance to hear, or otherwise I could go to jail. And so he did do a closed session with just members of Congress and no media, and who knows what he said.
Interesting.
Now, it is interesting, right, that a lot of what he said was like, this guy told me and I knew this. He did say in the public session, I have not seen anything with my own two eyes. And that often seems to be the case, right? You're always kind of one step removed. But honestly, there's a lot of there's a guy named Gary Nolan who is a professor of engineering at Stanford who has a piece of metal that he says is not from Earth. And he's experimenting on it as we speak. So there's a lot of kind of weird things like that drop occasionally.
Interesting. I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson making fun of it,
Oh,
saying,
yeah.
let me tell you about non-human biologics.
Yeah.
The plants,
All right.
the other animals.
Yeah.
You know, like that's such a vague thing.
Yeah.
There's
Well, it's
tons of non-human biologics
Yes.
on this earth.
Yes, absolutely. And Grush did say some, like Grush said also that during World War II, the US military and the Pope teamed up to recover a crashed craft in Northern Africa.
Okay.
Which is wow, you know.
Wow, yeah.
And some stuff that seems weirdly specific. I mean, as with everything, right? The UFO community is deeply divided about all of this. There are people's like, yeah, it's absolutely true. Other people are like, no, he's just attention seeker. And it always seems to be just one step beyond where we are. Right,
I
just
love
out of our reach.
I love the certainty.
I remember reading about William James's investigation of the paranormal around the turn of the century, and one phenomenon, well, one thing that they would find is that some of these people who professed psychics or
Mhm.
whatever, they would find evidence that they fudged, that they were
Mhm.
misled people, but
Yeah.
they would also find other things that they did which had no explanation, no
Mhm.
rational explanation, just things, objects flying around the room and things
Yeah,
like
and
that.
that is the Blue Book report, right? Is it the same report in 1968 that said like, there's nothing here. The only thing is that if enough Americans believe in this, our country's gonna go to hell. But they also said, right, we don't know, 20% of these cases we have no good answer for. Which is still there
Mhm.
and unresolved, yeah.
Tom DeLong, is that name
Oh,
you
yeah.
know?
Yes, yes.
Is Brush the one that's like connected with him and this
No,
organization?
that's Lou Elizondo. Do y'all know Tom DeLonge?
Mhm.
You know, all do know Tom DeLonge because he was the lead singer of Blink-182.
Nice.
Yes, and Angels and Airwaves also. Yeah, he has since retired from touring and has announced that from here on out, his career is going to be about exposing the truth about UFOs. And he has plowed some money into this. He set up an organization called To the Stars Academy. About 3 years ago, he had recruited a couple of fairly high-ranking government people. One named Christopher Mellon, who was an Undersecretary of Defense from I think the last years of Bill Clinton through Obama, and then a guy named Lou Elizondo. And Lou Elizondo says, I can go back. Yeah, great. Lou Elizondo was in charge of ATIP in the Pentagon for a while. Although there's been some debate about that as to how actually plugged in he was to ATIP. But anyhow, not Grush can't come along yet, but Tom DeLonge and these guys had a press conference about 3 years ago, in which they said, right, we have some evidence, and that's where we got some of these videos from, these strange videos.
Is the Tic Tac one of those?
Yes, the Tic Tacs, there are 3. Tic Tac is one of them. There Go Fast and Gimbal are the nicknames for the others. Now, what DeLonge said, more is coming, but we got David Grush, but again, right, one step away.
So far, it's just been requested by T-shirts.
Yeah, the To the Stars Academy actually is not registered as a nonprofit, which is interesting. It is registered as a corporation. So who knows if Tom DeLonge might be wanting to. No, he's got a lot of money, but might be wanting to monetize that. I will say this though: I think DeLonge is 100% a true believer in UFOs. And it actually has been confirmed, and this is a bit bizarre. He said at that press conference that he had meetings with really high-ranking people in the Pentagon about UFOs, and the Pentagon confirmed that. And so, if he were just kind of like an ex-rock star dude, why would they agree to meet with him about UFOs? But they did, and they have confirmed that they did. So I don't know what's going on there. So, yeah.
So we have this with the U.S. military might. What about other countries like Australia? Are there similar kinds of things going on? And cover up / the government knows, the public doesn't.
And this is really fascinating, right? It's something I write about in the book is if this had happened 50 years earlier, it wouldn't have been the military. Right? That everyone in America in the 40s and 50s and 60s assumed this is something the military should deal with. That's a product of the Cold War. It's a product of the rise of the national security state. Right? And then the military kind of just took over the whole UFO thing in our society. And it is true that in some other countries, it is very similar. In Canada and in Britain, there are official military investigations that have produced reports. Some of them have gone public, some of them have not. The British report has gone mostly public, which is why we know a lot about it. But in other countries, there's other stuff happening. It has been confirmed that there is an official Russian state-run UFO investigation happening. Nobody knows anything about what it's found, but Vladimir Putin wanted to have one, so there is one. In China, very similar. There is an official Chinese investigation as well. Now, we don't know what they found. They're not sharing with us, but it is something that's going on around the world.
And I think there's a whole rush, kind of it's a non-Christian religion, I guess more, anyway, we'll just call it, not traditionally religious belief called cosmism, I think that's.
Oh, yeah.
That was part of their space program, influenced people in the space
Yes,
program.
yes. Now that's Soviet. There are some Soviet archives that have been opened about UFO investigations, and we do know the Russians were investigating these things for much the same reason the US government was in the Cold War, because they were afraid they were American things coming over to zap them.
Madison.
Yeah.
Where does that leave you? You're a scholar, you've
Yeah.
like.
Are you reading this? Or is
No,
this
this is me. Because like you're a scholar, you've
Yeah.
written a book on it, you've done all this stuff, and like there is certainly like an academic remove that like
Mhm.
enables you to like
Yeah.
do all this stuff without bias or anything, but like where are you at?
Yeah. Well, and this is actually something I tell my students is without bias is not a thing.
Yeah.
Nobody's objective, right? Everyone has their own point of view. And I think, you might have sensed when I was talking about him that I have some sympathy with Jacques Vallée. And I think he's right to say that we cannot necessarily separate post 1947 UFOs and pre 1947 weird things in the sky, right? I think human beings have always seen strange things in the sky, things we cannot explain, and continue to do so. And I don't know what they are. There's something weird happening, but I'm not quite ready to jump on the bandwagon of saying they're us from the future, or they're from another dimension or whatever. I do think them being from another dimension may seem more plausible than them flying here from other planets. Just because the space is big. But I'm not a physicist. I have no idea what I'm talking about when I say it. So
Well, to bridge on that, how is it intersected with your theology, your belief? As a lot of saying.
yeah. There's been so much kind of Christian argument about this. One thing I found as I've been working on this book is in the 17th century, the Jesuits were arguing about whether or not Jesus died for life on other planets or not, or if they needed their own saviors and stuff like that.
Prejudice.
Yeah, this is 17th century,
Yeah.
right? And they concluded actually that Jesus did not die for them because they are not descended from Adam and Eve. Which is an interesting little twist of theology, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Library world story, like, about a savior on another.
But there's.
And you'll find Mormons thinking about that too, right?
Yeah,
for
There's
sure.
kind of
I've heard that.
So it's almost interdimensional.
Yeah, well,
Of what we would.
this is for myself, right? I kind of, one of the things I think that many people find appealing about Mormon theology is how kind of clean and cut and dried it often is, and materialist in a sense. And yeah, I think that tends to obscure the extent to which little is understood. And yeah, it obscures the extent to which, the universe is a far weirder place than we tend to think it is. We all want certainty, right? We all kind of glom onto whatever language it is will explain everything for us, whether that be the language of science or the language of therapy and so on and so forth, right? A kind of theory of everything sort of stuff. But there's, in 20 years, there's always going to be another theory of everything.
Yeah.
And I tell my students that in 200 years, our descendants are going to look at us and think like, look how ridiculous they are, right?
Sure hits.
Yes.
But your next book is gonna kind of explore this.
Yeah, I'm interested in how Mormons have thought about what weird things in the sky are. And,
Including angels,
maybe,
like
right?
including Angel Moroni?
Yeah, Angel Moroni is a weird thing in the sky. And there are some Mormon theorists who have written a lot about that. There's one guy named Frank Salisbury, who's a professor at Utah State, who he wrote a book in the 70s about Utah UFO sightings, and he said essentially, I cannot figure these things out. But then in the 90s, he revises the book and says, here's what explains it: wormholes. How did the Angel Moroni get into Joseph Smith's bedroom? Wormholes. Right. So, yeah.
So I'm curious if UFO people and other kinds of paranormal activity people talk to each other.
They do,
Okay.
yes, and so the interdimensional UFO people get along really well with other
Yeah,
paranormal
yeah, yeah.
people.
Thanks.
Because they will often use that phrase, the phenomenon,
Mhm.
right, and they'll say like, yeah, Bigfoot's part of the phenomenon, and ghosts are part of the phenomenon, everything, it's all one big weird thing that's happening.
Mm.
Skinwalker Ranch is a great example of
That's
this.
gonna bring.
Yeah, oh, yeah. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
Ask about that too.
Yeah.
Skinwalker Ranch, so in the 1980s, LDS family, the Shermans, moved onto this ranch out near Roosevelt. And they began saying weird things were happening to them. The major ones were they would see a gigantic black wolf, 6 feet tall at the shoulder, just stalking around their property. They shot at it a few times and nothing happened. They also talked about seeing lights in the sky, orbs circling their house. At one point, a couple of them claimed that they were out on the ranch one night and a bright orange light opened in the sky and a black thing crawled out of it and then it closed again. Stuff like that. Right? In the 1990s, this story got around, and a guy named Frank Bigelow bought the place. Frank Bigelow is the founder, not of Econo Lodge, but the other one, the other budget hotel chain
Motel
in
Six?
America. Not Motel 6,
Okay.
it's like Value Lodge or something like that. He's a billionaire. He has an aerospace company, and he's really interested in UFOs. So he bought Skinwalker Ranch, and he sent some people there. IDS, okay, Discovery, the Institute for Discovery Sciences. He hired a bunch of scientists and sent them to Skinwalker Ranch and said, "Go see what you can find." It was actually him who went to Harry Reid in 2004, and he said the government should be looking at this stuff. And then Harry Reid's like, "Yeah, I think that's true." And so that's where we got ATIP. Harry Reid.
Wow.
Harry Reid is the guy who got ATIP funded. The original of his friend Robert Bigelow, who is a Nevadan, who lives in Las Vegas. So he and Harry Reid go way back because he's a rich Nevadan and Harry Reid liked rich Nevadans.
For some reason.
So Bigelow had this place for a few years. Then the government poured a lot of money into it beginning in 2004, and a lot of government people went to Skinwalker Ranch and began doing stuff. And they actually did. There's some pretty weird stories that come out of this. One guy said that one morning he went into the kitchen of the farmhouse there and he saw a gigantic set of organ pipes hovering in midair, and they were playing a song, and then they vanished.
Was that after his DMT or?
Lots of stuff like this, right? And now, eventually, the people back in the Pentagon were not satisfied with the reports they were getting from Skinwalker Ranch. They said this is all kind of like weird anecdotal stuff. There's no actual measurables here, so they shut it down. And Bigelow sold it to Brandon Fugel, whose name you see when you're driving down all the buildings. Brandon Fugel will say, if you ask him, he will, and if you have a camera on, he will say, I bought this place because I'm fascinated by this, all, et cetera, I want to know about UFOs. And he founded the miniseries, right?
Right.
I suspect he bought it to cash in. So he could get a miniseries and then sort of an investment as much as anything else. But yeah. So
Did
Skinwalker
ride
Ranch-
his black helicopter and.
Yeah. Skinwalker Ranch is a site of the phenomenon, right? UFOs, but also all sorts of weird, strange stuff.
Cattle mutilation.
Yeah, spiritual phenomenon, manifestations of all types and all sorts. Now, but then there are also, though, some really hardcore interplanetary people or extraterrestrial hypothesis people who really are annoyed when UFOs are associated with like channeling or possessions or instruments appearing in the kitchen. Yeah, because they're like, no, this is just science. They're just a species from another planet. There's all this woo-woo stuff is not for us, right? So yeah, there are fights about this in the UFO world.
Anything else?
So
Should we
interesting.
call it? Let's give Matt a hand. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
That was
It's a lot of fun.
so fun.
Super.
Yeah, I told Matt when he came, I didn't put a chair up here because I knew I didn't need a chair. He'd be all over the place.
I prefer not to have one.
Last time I had you come, I can't remember what the topic was. It was
Correlation.
Yeah, it was so good.
Yeah.
anyway, you know, if general authorities at general conference would do what you do, we wouldn't fall asleep. We'd be awake. And riveted, it'd be riveted.
Came back and then the chat lines would be, yeah.
So thank you. And thanks to all of you on this dark and stormy night for coming out. And those on Zoom for attending. Greatly appreciate you and your input, thoughts and questions. So thanks again to the Spanglers. And Faith Matters Zoom, and Madison for hosting, keeping an eye on Zoom for you folks there. And we'll call it good. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Excellent.
Hey.
Mhm.
That was great.
That
I
was
could
great.
listen to
So
it.